And now let's talk about another fourth album that just came out this past weekend. Vampire Weekend's Father of the Bride. Been anticipating this album for a while, Dave. I think it was on our most anticipated albums of 2019 earlier in the year. Singles have been dropping. We've been adding some to our playlist. Again, check that out. I know that you're not a big Vampire Weekend fan, actually. I reported you to Twitter for for calling them dorks this past weekend.
I think that's part of their charm. That's part of their appeal, is that they're a bunch of dorks, bunch of waspy Ivy League New York City residents, or formerly New York City residents. I thought that was like the whole point, especially back in like '08 when it was Vampire Weekend mania, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, am I wrong with that? Like, is that not the ideal for VW?
Yeah, I don't know about dorks per se. That seems a bit harsh, but I do think part of their aesthetic is that they were these like Ivy League, kind of uppity kids who were preppy kids who were capturing, I think, this like punk-ish sound while also pulling on all these other like eclectic other influences, but they didn't really feel like their like the anger that comes with punk music was earned because they were these upper middle class kids making music and talking about existential crises and kind of just making these albums about like figuring life out, finding religion and spirituality within a world that doesn't always make sense, and exploring different cultures. Like I don't think they ever felt it was earned to be angry. And I think especially on this album, they don't lean into anger at all. It's actually probably their most mainstream, to go back to Local Natives, mainstream and American influence album that they've dropped to date. And I'm wondering, did that make this an enjoyable listen for you?
I like this way more than the other three. I guess Modern Vampires of the City was my favorite of the first three. But can't really take much away from it. I mean, other than like songs like A-Punk and Cousins from the first two records, I didn't really care for much of the music. It was just too soft for me ultimately. But I do appreciate the melding of genres and sounds from song to song. Like, there's a fair amount of African drum influence if you look for it on some of the other older albums. And whether you have a problem with that or not, it's there. But for Father of the Bride, which, by the way, I respect the 6-year layoff, or almost 6-year layoff between albums. That's not common for bands this big. And actually, I was thinking, before we even get in the album, is Vampire Weekend like the last like great rock band or last great like big band? Like I was trying to think, like around that time, Tame Impala and Fleet Foxes first came out, and if we like separate like really pop influence acts like 21 Pilots and 1975. Is there anyone that got this big between 2008 and now? And like, apologies to Greta Van Fleet, but like, real bands.
Shots. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it. What, 2008? When did the Killers drop? Way before that.
Yeah, they're like Killers, Arcade Fire. They're all like early mid-aughts.
Earlier.
Pretty Projectors, same thing. It feels like Vampire Weekend, like the last breath of like the New York / Brooklyn indie scene that was so vibrant at that time, post Strokes and stuff. Kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, in the recent biography, not biography, I'm sorry, oral history, Meet Me in the Bathroom, they were mentioned it, but they're in like the later chapters. It's kind of like the end of that era. So yeah, it probably makes sense that they were like the first like major rock band to break out like that. I guess like Florence and the Machine was probably also around that time, maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's any others.
I'm excluding like bad bands like Mumford and Imagine Dragons. Like besides them,
yeah, no, I think Florence would probably be the only other one I can think of at the moment. Because Paramore was also before that. So yeah. The 6-year layoff though. In that time, Ezra Koenig, the lead singer of Vampire Weekend, moved from New York, which was kind of, he moved to LA, which was kind of, I think, spurned by his aspirations to be more into the music scene, but also be living with his wife Rashida Jones. They have a kid together now. In that time, he's worked with a lot of pop artists, Carly Rae Jepsen, Charlie XCX. He produced and co-wrote on "Hold Up" by Beyonce, which is, I don't know. He had a really interesting story
Yeah,
in the interview
funny
where,
story.
yeah, he basically had made this song with Diplo and really wanted to put on a Vampire Weekend album. It kind of just like sat around for 2 years, and someone was like, "Hey, Beyonce really likes this song. Would you give it to her?" And he's like, "Really?" Sure. Like, and ended up hearing it and like knew right away it's supposed to be a Beyonce song, which is pretty awesome. Also, shouts to Diplo, who apparently is like a genius.
Yeah. Just helped marry Joe Jonas and Sophie Turner. He's always around. That's Diplo's thing.
um, but yeah, so the thing about Vampire Weekend is, like you said, they can be a little dorky, but they're very tight band, and I think I don't know if experimental is the right way to put them, but they definitely are unique sounding. There's not really other bands that pull together these influences in such a cohesive way, and I think Father of the Bride is probably their least cohesive album. It is probably the weakest written album, which I think can be debated. But
Shots.
well, it's a different style, and that we talked.
You
I
mean
think
a less good style?
it's a different style, and I'll say that because Ezra talked about in interviews leading up that he was actually collaborating or getting some advice from Casey Musgraves on how to write more straightforward. Vampire Weekend is known for having these very like intricate and like layered lines, but almost like he's trying to pack too much into each sentence
Right.
and each verse, and it was almost
Dense.
too heady. So he wanted to make it a little bit more straightforward. So I think that does take away a little bit from the album in terms of what he was trying to get at, but I think it also makes for some of the most pleasant songs that they've ever made.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, leading up to this, I listened to this first singles and I was like, I'm not really having this. It's dull. But then honestly, like once I listen to the whole album, I get the Harmony Hall hype. I understand. It's good.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good song. I say I like the song. I also like Sunflower. Shout out Steve Lacy.
Yeah.
What's the other one? Unbearably White? Something like that?
Unbearably White's really good.
Yeah.
I really like This Life, which seems to be like a pretty clear Van Morrison pull. Harmony Hall, I hear a lot of like Grateful Dead, Rolling Stones influence. I also think they really tried to still infuse a lot of different sounds, like Flower Moon, very clear like Brazilian jazz, and also Steve Lacy influenced song. Sympathy was like this gothy flamenco sounding song, very like intense strumming, which I thought was really cool on it. And there's a lot to like. What did you think about Danielle Hames' presence on this album?
I was just gonna ask about that. She's on what, 3 tracks?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
she's featured on 3 tracks, and she's backing vocals, I think, on 3 more.
Yeah. Unexpected. Honestly, I'd like to hear more of the Haim sisters, just because that second album kind of came and went in 2017, I think it was. So
Left a lot to be desired.
and like they're still by all accounts widely regarded within the music making community. So this is actually a really big look, given the nadir, not nadir, but cresting of the Haim career at this time. So yeah, I thought she was good. Well used. I mean,
Yeah.
even though I'm not the biggest fan of what Vampire Weekend does, I would never say they're bad composers or anything. They definitely know how to pick their spots. So I think at worst, the album is just super inoffensive. You're never going to listen to any of these songs. Like, oh, this song is trash, or this song it makes my ears bleed. No, none of that's ever true. It's just whether you care enough about the lyrics or when it gets a little slower or softer, if you can still engage. And that's kind of where I fall out, to be expected, though.
Yeah. Modern Vampires of the City was pretty close to a perfect album. It's very cohesive. Each track sounds different, but they still have all these ties that pull it together. And it's some of the best writing they've ever done. Rostam was a huge influence on that. He produced the whole thing, and I think his presence is really evident, or his absence is very evident in this.
He gone.
Yeah, because he's not. I mean, he was what on one song, which I think is "We Belong Together." He produced and helped write, but other than that, he's not really that on much of the album. And you don't really hear much of Chris Thompson or Chris Baio either. And this really feels like Ezra, like he's had 6 years to gestate and kind of think about what he wanted Vampire Weekend to be, and he wanted to make it a little bit more jammy, I think. And I think that doesn't really fit for Rostam. He's very precise in terms of how he produces, and I think this is very much like Ezra and Friends in a lot of ways with Chris Thompson and Chris Baio instead of Vampire Weekend in total.
Do you think this is the last Vampire Weekend record, or do you think maybe Ezra uses the Vampire Weekend name for a pseudo solo project moving forward? Do you think this Ezra focus, creative focus, continues, or do you think it just stops altogether?
Well, I mean, it's obvious Ezra is he's the breakout. I mean, he's the
Well, that's been the case, obviously.
but Rostam got a lot of love, and I think I don't see why Chris Thompson and Chris Baio wouldn't want to continue doing it unless they really feel like they're being pushed out of the creative process, which we haven't gotten any indication of that. So I don't think it'll be the last Vampire Weekend album, but I do expect there to be a sizable gap between the next one, and I would guess Ezra is probably going to do a lot more solo work, a lot more producing. Um, I expect to see him like featured on a lot of albums coming up. Like I would guess probably. I mean, Jenny Lewis is actually
Yep.
on 2021. It says The Boy on it, which I think is fucking hilarious because you never would have known it. But I'm guessing he'll probably be collaborating with her, probably Casey Musgraves, probably the Haim sisters. I expect to see him a lot of places um, as he seems to be now reinvigorated by this album. I'm actually seeing them in September, but they just had a show at Webster Hall where they did 3 sets, played this straight through, and apparently people that were there said that it was like one of the best shows they've ever been to. So I think as a band, they're still beloved. They're still tight as ever live, and they're really fun to see live. But I just think in terms of what you expect from Vampire Weekend, this album kind of subverts a lot of that and leaves a little bit to be desired. Overall, I think this is still like top line indie music. So if you like it, you got to listen to
Low
Vampire.
bar.
Shots. Don't appreciate that. I'm going to be reporting you to Jack again. You're going to get that account shut down.